Hi, everyone. Welcome to the SSP Wednesday seminar. I'm Taylor Fable, Director of MIT's Security Studies Program. I'm really delighted today to welcome a colleague from the History Department, Elena Kempf. So I met Elena over a year ago, not at MIT. So I was at the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. There was a workshop on the laws of war. I'm having dinner, sitting and talking to this very interesting person. I'm like, oh, where are you from? She's like, oh, I'm from MIT. I was like, oh, I'm from MIT. Clearly, we need to do a better job of finding folks with sort of convergent interests from other departments. I'm really glad we found a Wednesday where you can come and speak to us. So she is a historian of international law in modern Germany in a global context. She's currently working on a book on the history of weapons prohibitions in international law from the 1860s to the 1970s. In addition, she maintains a research interest in the relationship between the German Federal Constitutional Court and the Court of Justice in the EU, and current or forthcoming publications in critical military studies, API, Unbound, the University of Pennsylvania Law Review, and the Book Journal of International Law. She earned her PhD in history from UC Berkeley in 2021. And prior to joining MIT, she taught as a lecturer at the Department of History at Stanford University and served as a postdoctoral fellow at the Miller Institute for Global Challenges in Law at UC Berkeley. So, Elena, welcome to the Security Studies program. It's great to have you with us today.
Okay, thank you so much, Taylor. Thank you, Vipin in absentia, for having me. And thank you, of course, the SSP for putting on the seminar series, and to all of you for being here. Is this mic on? Is the volume good? Okay, perfect. So let's jump right in. I don't think I need to tell this audience that our present is characterized by fast and arguably accelerating changes in the technologies of war. But perhaps I can tell this audience that this present has a history that begins, depending on which historian you ask, in the early 1800s with the onset of the Industrial Revolution, as Trevor Dupuy, a colonel, military historian, and co-founder of the Harvard Defense Studies program, argued, or in 1848 with the invention of the mini bullet, as German global historian Jürgen Osterhammel argues. Where there is agreement is that by the 1860s and the onset of the Second Industrial Revolution in Europe and North America, the improvement of existing and innovation of new weapons accelerated. In short order, connoidal bullets, an early machine gun, and more effective breech loading technologies, smokeless powder in 1884, here depicted in Polish railway financiers Jan Gottlieb Bloch's 1898, The Future of War, and ever more destructive cannons emerged on the scene, among other weapons. Now, this change is not just visible to the historian in retrospect, but was also a pervasive observation by contemporaries. The liberal philosopher and member of parliament, John Stuart Mill, for example, in a speech in the House of Commons in August 1867, lamented a world in which, quote, inventive genius with all the lights of modern science and all the resources of modern industry girded itself to the work of destruction as its principal task, and bringing forth every year more and more terrific engines for blasting hosts of human beings into atoms, together with the defenses by which they vainly seek to shelter themselves. Some of John Stuart Mill's terrific engines were prohibited under international law from the 1860s onwards. A prohibition on the use of small caliber explosive bullets in 1868 was followed by 3 prohibitions codified in 1899 at the Hague Peace Conference on the use of projectiles whose sole purpose it was to disperse gas, the throwing of explosives from balloons, but only for 5 years, and bullets that expand or flatten in the human body. And third and lastly, by the Geneva Gas Protocol on the use of chemical and bacteriological weapons in 1925. Now, over the course of this time period between the 1860s and the 1920s, there were also attempts to prohibit military aircraft and bombing, submarines, and torpedoes, but these attempts did not result in legal codification. After this first age of weapons prohibitions during the machine age, there was an almost half-century-long hiatus during which no new weapons were prohibited. This hiatus was ended by the Biological Weapons Convention, which was signed in 1972 and went into effect in 1975. And since then, a new second age of weapons prohibitions has unfolded, bringing with it prohibitions, again, sort of more expansive prohibitions on chemical weapons, fragments not detectable by X-ray, blinding laser weapons, anti-personnel landmines, and even nuclear weapons, among others. It is this history that I want to talk about today, the history of prohibitions on some new weapons in the age of industrial machines, and then in some epilogical reflections, if that's a word, I also want to reflect on how this history may have reverberated in the context of modern biology in the 1960s. And I want to tell this history in a particular way, one that emphasizes the ideas that animated the calls to prohibit some weapons rather than others in an age of almost overwhelming technological change. That is, I am interested in the history of the different concepts that were called upon to differentiate between lawful and unlawful weapons. Over time, I argue, three overlapping and intersecting conceptual frameworks emerged. The first one, represented here on the left on the slide, centered on the individual, but importantly anonymous body of the combatant and opposed the infliction of unnecessary suffering. The second, represented here by a mural by Diego Rivera at the Detroit Institute of Art, was centered on threats to the collective of European, quote, civilization, and in an anti-apocalyptic key, opposed what they anticipated to be the catastrophic end of their world. Both of these machine-age ideas against some weapons were based on measurements or predictions of future harm that could be known, anticipated, or at the very least imagined. By contrast, when wide-ranging prohibitions not only of the use, but also research in, manufacture of, and trade in biological weapons was discussed in the 1960s in the United States, a discourse animated by opposition to unknowable consequences of genetic mutation caused by biological weapons emerged alongside it. So this history of ideas embeds something that's typically considered either a specialist legal history or a specialist diplomatic history within a panoply of people who had something to say about and a stake in emerging weapons technologies. It is no accident, in other words, that this slide brings together fragments by a German military surgeon, a mural by Diego Rivera, and the cover of an article by an American molecular biologist. In my talk today, I will share vignettes on each of these discourses from the moment when they first emerged, the 1860s to 1890s, for the discourse on unnecessary suffering, the 1910s to 1920s, for the anti-apocalyptic discourse, and then very briefly at the end, the 1960s. And in each of these moments, as I hope to show, the idea that to prohibit some of these weapons under international law would benefit humanity in war was contested. So this was not an unproblematic idea. For example, before the First World War, the techno-optimist ideas that new weapons would either make war more brutal and therefore shorten and humanize it was widespread, as was the similarly techno-optimist idea that some new weapons would cause wounds that were more humane than those caused by old weapons. In mid-19th century Europe, the techno-utopian idea that transgressively destructive weapons would maintain peace also emerged and reverberated thereafter. Okay. So on to the first idea that was foundational to prohibiting some weapons rather than others. In the 50 years before the First World War, diplomats, international lawyers, military surgeons, and an increasingly large public constructed the idea that there was a limit to the legitimate wounding of the anonymously individual combatant. This idea began in legal treatises, was then retooled as a diplomatic instrument, and was then refined and measured by military surgeons and terminal ballistics researchers. And throughout this history, the concept of unnecessary suffering was at the center of these discourses and practices. At its heart was an attempt to limit the temporal effect of war on the soldier. In other words, it was a calculus of optimally calibrated violence. Perfect. In 1868, the Declaration of St. Petersburg outlawed the use of small caliber explosive bullets in wars between signatory states. This was the first ever weapons prohibition in positive international law. The preamble of the prohibition, which you see on the slide, expressed the idea that only injury necessary for obtaining military victory was lawful. War, in this view, should be confined to putting enemy combatants out of action. Wounding or killing beyond this point was unnecessary and therefore unlawful. Explosive bullets, small caliber explosive bullets, the declaration argued, crossed this boundary by causing unnecessarily cruel wounds. And therefore, to reconcile again the progress of technology with humanity, these bullets should be prohibited under international law. Now, this prohibition was negotiated by military experts representing 17 states, most, though not all of them, European, at the Russian War Ministry in St. Petersburg, and was subsequently ratified and therefore went into effect. But the story of the discourse of unnecessary suffering is not just a legal and diplomatic story. In the 1860s, unnecessary suffering was also already a moral language widely used and understood beyond the halls of the Russian War Ministry. The Exposition Universelle in Paris, a World's Fair held from April through November 1867, was one of the events that prompted such expressions in written form, as it included many displays of weapons, especially along the outer perimeter of the oval where the exhibitions took place. Which included both a French explosive bullet and, as you see here on the right, a Prussian Krupp cannon that will become important later. So remember this image of the 50-ton Prussian Krupp cannon. The exhibition of these new weapons, and particularly the explosive bullet, prompted a lot of commentary in the European press. The London-based reformist paper Daily News, for example, that you see here on the left, and that was founded by none other than Charles Dickens in the 1840s, reflected on the French explosive bullet shown at the exposition a year later. After describing the bullet and trials that had been staged at the exposition, the paper briefly entertained the question of whether the invention of such a weapon, quote, deserves thanks, but then decided that the use of an explosive bullet was to, quote, wantonly aggravate the horrors of war. In language very similar to that of the preamble of the St. Petersburg Declaration, the author concluded that, quote, if a bullet brings down a combatant and disables him, it does its work. But one of these explosive balls would so tear a limb that if it did not cause the wounded soldier to bleed to death, it would certainly cause an immense amount of unnecessary pain and a degree of constitutional disturbance that would in nearly every case be fatal. Now, this commentary on the French bullet and the St. Petersburg Declaration was all the more remarkable for the fact that it appeared in a British paper because actually the posture of the British military experts at St. Petersburg and in general British policy was very much opposed to prohibiting any kind of new weapon in the 1860s. So this was not just a representation of British state interest. We also have commentary by US commissioners who were sent to the Paris exhibition to explore and comment and report back on the new European weapons on display there. And you see that here on the right. And they too condemned the explosive bullet. Explosive bullets, Norton and Valentine wrote, quote, must be classed with poisonous arrows or any other hellish contrivance that will enable men to kill rather than cure the wounded. While many a wounded soldier has lived for years with a bullet in his body or his limbs, such would seldom be the case with wounds inflicted by the jagged and over-tormenting splinters of an explosive bullet. So, in mid-1860s Europe then, and also in North America, a discourse was emerging that identified temporary wounding rather than killing or even unnecessary aggravation of wounding as the legitimate object of war. And this discourse centered or used the individual soldier's body as a unit of measurement for humanity in war. Now, one thing I find very interesting about this discourse is that on the one hand, this idea of optimally calibrated violence, right, the wound that wounds just enough to put the soldier out of action, but no more, coexisted side by side, sometimes in the same text and sometimes even in the same person, with a defense of other weapons that either wounded greatly or necessarily killed. So for an example for that, let's dwell on Norton and Valentine's report on the Paris Exposition a bit longer. While both of them condemned the French explosive bullet for killing rather than leaving open the possibility of caring for the wounded or curing the wounded, they endorsed other new weapons that were built to kill great numbers of soldiers all at once. Perhaps this should not be surprising given the fact that they were reporting back to the government in DC only 2 years after the end of the US Civil War, but it's still noteworthy. Specifically, they endorsed and even argued in favor of the humanity of, quote, any torpedo that would sink a ship of war or even a fleet of ships by a single explosion, or any projectile that would sweep away whole battalions at once, as welcome means of shortening the horrors of war. Their joint commitment to techno-pessimist ideas against small caliber explosive bullets and techno-optimist ideas about large caliber explosives like torpedoes was common. And this strain of thought is interesting to me because it illustrates how very much a calculus rather than an emotional concern for suffering mankind or individuals drove weapons prohibitions in the 19th century. Even to those who endorsed the prohibition of some weapons, great suffering and killing was lawful if it perhaps would shorten the horrors of war. And the small caliber explosive bullets were apparently not part of such a strategy. They were too focused on the individual compared to the weapons of mass destruction they argued would end war sooner, and therefore they should be prohibited. Very briefly, let me just provide one more example of this coexistence of, on the one hand, a condemnation of unnecessary suffering with an embrace of weapons of mass destruction, this time drawn from a London-based Jesuit publication called The Month, a magazine and review. And I want to do this to illustrate that this coexistence was not just a convenient stance offered by people serving a state engaged in building up its arsenal. In the article on view here, titled The Proposed Mitigation of War, the author wondered whether the new inventions of military science were likely to increase or decrease the evils of war. And the answer the author suggested was twofold. In general, the new weapons, like conical rifled shot and torpedoes, would make wars more brutal, but also shorten them and therefore serve humanity. But the author's weapons optimism had some limits. Some weapons, like small caliber explosive bullets, were, quote, barbaric and should be prohibited under international law. Now, this coexistence of, on the one hand, a condemnation of some bullets because they caused wounds that were unnecessarily cruel, and on the other hand, an embrace of other new weapons because they would serve humanity in war, persisted into the 1890s. And the 1890s differed from the 1860s in two ways that are important for us today. First, as Martti Koskiniemi has shown, by the 1890s, international law had emerged as a liberal profession and practice. And in addition, also following the Franco-Prussian War, a new science of terminal ballistics, so the science of measuring the effect of new bullets on, in the end, the human body, but also sometimes using stand-in materials, had become professionalized as well. And these two changes came to a head at the 1899 Hague Peace Conference, which, as I mentioned in the beginning of my talk, issued prohibitions on expanding bullets, gas projectiles, and for the limited period of 5 years, an early form of bombing, the throwing of explosives from balloons. And I want to focus here specifically on the prohibition of expanding bullets and the rise of terminal ballistics, because that was the issue that was most debated, not just at the Hague Peace Conference, but also by military surgeons and increasingly large publics. Now, compared to the 1860s, military surgeons in the late 1880s and then especially in the 1890s newly used experiments to measure the difference between bullets that inflicted necessary versus unnecessary suffering. And in the process, the idea that it was military victory that determined the extent of necessary suffering gave way even more to the idea that surgeons' ability to mend wounds defined the limits of lawful weaponry. That is, the limits of legitimate instruments of war were where the ability of surgeons to reconstitute the body ended. No person, in my view, better encapsulates the experimental measurement of unnecessary suffering than Paul von Bruns. And you see excerpts from 2 of his studies up here on the slide. Von Bruns was a military surgeon and also professor at the University of Tübingen in South Germany. And his work on bullets arose from a real sense of crisis. At 25 years of age, he had served in the Franco-Prussian War as a field surgeon, and he had been surprised by the effect of the newly introduced French bullets. And therefore, he embraced and took to the new science of terminal ballistics after the war to not be surprised again in the future. And interestingly, von Bruns began his foray into this new discipline of terminal ballistics as a pronounced techno-optimist. In his mind, technological innovation in bullets would deliver the dream of humane warfare. In an article titled, on the left you have the German, but I'll give you the English, The Bullet Effects of the New Small Caliber Rifles, a Contribution to the Assessment of Bullet Wounds in Future Wars, published in 1890, von Bruns argued for the humanitarian character of small caliber fully jacketed bullets because they left, quote, pure and smooth wounds and therefore could be mended rather than necessitating amputation. And in von Bruns's opinion, this meant that, quote, the new small caliber rifle and the bullets were not only the best, but also the most humane weapon to mitigate the horrors of war as much as possible. Medical ability to mitigate the damage caused by certain weapons here rendered those weapons arguably humane. Expanding bullets, long used in hunting and newly introduced by the British Army in India in the late 1890s, threatened to reverse the gains and the control people like von Bruns had gained as a result of the new small caliber fully jacketed bullets. And in response to this threat, in April 1898, von Bruns gave a paper at the 27th Congress of German Surgeons in Berlin on these expanding bullets. And in this talk, he called for the prohibition under international law of these bullets. And this call was based on another study in terminal ballistics that he had undertaken later in the 1890s. And in this study, he established exactly where this expanding bullet fell on the divide between military necessity and inhumanity. And now they really employed cutting-edge technology to make these claims. In addition to the usual descriptions and photos, photos like the one you see on the left, The article included 5 X-ray photographs, as they called them, one of which you see here on the right. X-rays are commonplace to us today, but they had only been invented by Wilhelm Röntgen in his lab at the University of Würzburg in 1895. And they merely granted a look into the wound without dissecting and thereby altering it. Now, as you can see as well on this X-ray photograph on the slide, von Bruns found that the expanding bullet caused lacerated wounds and splintered bones. Such wounds, von Bruns observed, could not be mended and would typically necessitate amputation, an outdated form of treatment. Therefore, they should be prohibited. Von Bruns then, across these 2 studies, had an ambivalent view of the relationship between new weapons and the humanization of war. On the one hand, he was a techno-optimist, framing the new small caliber bullets as ushering in a humane present in which the effects of war would be limited in time due to the mendability of the human body. But not all new technologies serve to humanize war, according to von Bruns, and expanding bullets threaten to undo what he called the, quote, progress of small caliber bullets, and hence should be prohibited. Okay, so this is a detour, so I'm not going to inflict a lot about this on you, but it's very interesting that this discourse of unnecessary cruelty, right, it began as a legal idea and then it became a diplomatic one. It was taken up by military surgeons, and it also reached people who were either really bullet engineers or weapons engineers or who dreamt of being one. And so they would then publish these proposals in military journals effectively. So this is the Kriegstechnische Zeitschrift, a journal on the technologies of war. And in the inaugural issue of this journal in 1898, there's an anonymous article on English dum-dum bullets, on these expanding bullets. Of course, also because of the geopolitical rivalry between Britain and Germany at the time, the author criticizes these expanding bullets, citing British military surgeons, which helps this person's case, and then says, look, I have a solution for you. Here is a bullet that is designed specifically to not violate the idea of unnecessary cruelty, while still also offering some of the benefits, questionable benefits, right, of expanding bullets. And so here you see how this particular bullet it has a leaden tip at the top. That's the C for greater stopping power, and this purported bullet engineer argues also to make the impact not unnecessarily gruesome. So, you know, these are the kinds of conceptual contortions and also technological innovations that this entire discourse then gives rise to, right? So, yeah, I want to do more research to see how far this proposal went. As far as I know, it didn't go any farther than the pages of this magazine, but I still find it interesting. It's an example. Okay. I want to add one more note before we move on into the 20th century on the 19th century history of moral thought on new weapons. We talked a lot about this entanglement of, on the one hand, techno-optimist ideas of the humane weapon or of the war-ending weapon and the pessimist discourse. But there were also utopian ideas already in the 1860s. And these utopian ideas hoped that if only transgressively destructive and terrible weapons could be adopted by all states, and all states always meant all European states and maybe North America, then peace could be maintained. And the example that comes to mind there harkens back to the Krupp cannon, the illustration of which I shared earlier on when I talked about the Paris exposition. And here we have François Duswing, who is a French journalist and sort of an official delegate to this exposition. And he comments on his impression on this Krupp cannon, which was sort of a cause célèbre of this World's Fair. And here's what he writes, and I will quote this in some length. He writes, If the various exhibiting countries wanted to prove by the display of their respective destructive devices that they are capable of waging war, I would have liked this to be so obvious that war would henceforth become impossible in the face of equal destructive power. And the question on his mind then was who, which state, would, quote, exhibit a weapon perfect enough to defeat an army of 300,000 men in a quarter of an hour. The day such a weapon would be invented, he thought, would be the day men would look for another way than war to come to an agreement. And I want to just draw your attention here again to his turn of phrase that he was looking for equal destructive power as a tool for the maintenance of peace. So that's clearly silent, right, on imperial war and colonial war. This would be peace on the European continent and maybe in the transatlantic world, but no more. Okay, moving into the 20th century and the rise of a new idea at the heart of why some weapons should have or should be prohibited under international law. And that brings us into the 1910s and the invention of heavier than air flight. Okay. So after the Wright brothers' flight in 1903 and the first ever commission of a heavier than air military aircraft by the US in 1910, a new idea emerged to motivate weapons prohibitions. This idea warned of the end of industrial European empire in an apocalyptic key and was centered on the concept of, quote, civilization. And unlike the earlier idea of unnecessary suffering, this anti-apocalyptic idea was collective and was concerned with shielding Europe, European culture, European empire, European industry from self-destruction. And if in the 19th century, people in favor of weapons prohibitions had been predominantly diplomats and then also military surgeons, so all people tasked with planning and preparing for the next inevitable war, this new anti-apocalyptic idea was first proposed by peace activists, who also thought that the next war was inevitable, but who feared it rather than actively planned for it. Bertha von Suttner, the Bohemian peace activist and novelist and also acquaintance of Alfred Nobel's, exemplifies both transformations. In 1912, she published The Barbarization of the Sky, which you have here on the slide, to call for the prohibition of all military flight. In the 30-page pamphlet, she warned that air war would bring about the end of European civilization and culture. And she also decried the corruption of engineering for warlike purposes. W. Evans Darby, the secretary of the Peace Society in London, joined Suttner's campaign against military aircraft. And like Suttner, he lamented the military corruption of science and the implications of flight for the future, quote, peace and prosperity of the world. Now here, opposition to some weapons no longer rode on arguments about the violation of a limit to a certain degree of wounding. And instead, it started to be based on an apocalyptic imaginary about the self-destruction of European empire and industry, and perhaps even the world. But in the 1910s and 1909, the meaning of military flight for humanity in war remained contested. While some pacifists like Darby and Suttner called for the prohibition of military flight in this apocalyptic key, other members of the peace movement voiced utopian hopes that instead they would bring the end of war. Charles Richer, for example, the president of the permanent delegation of French peace societies, was one such pacifist techno-utopian. Writing in 1909, Richer attributed the absence of war between France and Germany since the Franco-Prussian War in 1870 to 71 to the arms race in firearms and, importantly, military flight. And he made a real argument about rational actors. So anticipating the enormous civilian cost of bombing, Richer predicted that, quote, we will recoil from the enormity of the crime. Perfected military aviation, he thought, would be an excellent and solid guarantee of peace. So, of course, the call to outlaw military airships and aircraft went unheeded. And as everyone in this room knows, these new machines also did not bring enduring peace. During the First World War, the German military bombed Antwerp, London, and Paris via Zeppelins, and also began to use airplane raids as part of their strategy. The First World War II, though, saw confusions about the use of prohibited ammunition where there had been none, and the use of these confusions for propaganda. And the war also, of course, brought with it the maturation of technologies like military aircraft, submarines, the invention of tanks, all of which put pressure on legal treaties and norms. And at this dire moment, many gave up on the idea of limiting and ordering war through law. But others remarkably doubled down on law because of the disappointments of the war and the urgencies created by the fast pace of technological change, including some scientists who foresaw ever faster technological change in the future. And this recommitment to weapons prohibitions occurred, as you might imagine, in the context of the League of Nations, and in particular, a body within the League of Nations called the Temporary Mixed Commission on Disarmament. And this Temporary Mixed Commission approached scientists with a request for their expert opinion on bacteriological, biological, and chemical weapons in war. And in response to their request for expert opinions, this committee then received 9 expert reports from chemists and biologists in France, Germany, the US, and Belgium, among others. And these reports, on the one hand, described the effects of bacteriological and chemical weapons in great detail and with scientific sophistication. And they also opined on their acceptability in war, sometimes citing international law. And this is not a clean story of just change over time and replacement of one idea that animated weapons prohibitions with another. And an example of that is the persistence, actually, of this old idea, the old calculus of optimally calibrated injury, now adopted by the people who were defending chemical weapons against prohibition. A key example of this is here the expert report by Joaquin Enrique Zanetti, who had been a member of the Chemical Warfare Service for the US in Europe during the First World War, and who was a professor of chemistry at Columbia University in New York. And in his report, Zanetti mounted a full-throated defense of chemical warfare, claiming that chemical warfare, quote, is not only the most practical and inexpensive, but also a more humane and, from the military point of view, far more effective type of warfare than any other type of warfare known in the present time. Warfare using non-lethal chemical weapons, like tear gas, for example, would permit the return to their normal occupation of the soldiers who have been eliminated from the battlefield anywhere from 2 weeks to 6 months. So in his reasoning here on chemical weapons, Zanetti sounds a lot like von Bruns, right, about 30 years earlier. Weapons were humane if their effect was limited in time, and this temporal limitation took on almost magical properties in this case, as non-lethal chemical weapons obviated the need for surgeons to mend human bodies. Time would take care of that itself. But in this particular moment in the 1920s, this old calculus of optimally calibrated violence and the humanity of a weapon did not carry the day. And instead, it was this new anti-apocalyptic calculus that did. And this new idea also emerged in other expert reports sent to the League of Nations. Richard Pfeiffer, a professor at Breslau University, for example, considered the effect of biological weapons on human, animal, and plant life in his report. And he wrote that he considered it a crime against humanity and all human feeling to think even of attempting to use for the destruction of life and health the achievements of modern medical science, whose aim is the safeguarding of human life and the prevention of epidemics. And he also warned about the difficulty of controlling epidemics because they could not be limited to the enemy forces, but would extend and affect the whole population, including women and children. This new warning about the wide effects of chemical and biological weapons also extended beyond the League of Nations. And there are many examples to draw on, and I just want to highlight here the work of Gertrude Woker, who was the first ever female professor of modern chemistry in Switzerland. And she critiqued the arguments of people like Zanetti, and then offered sort of a warning of impending apocalypse on her own. Now, her critique of the old calculus relies basically on the critique that it's overly rational. And she said this idea of any kind of humane weapon, right, whether that's a humane bullet or a humane, the idea that chemical weapons are humane, are, and here I'm quoting her, at least in part, in conscious exclusion of empathy. The intellectual game of the modern scientist with words, with arguments, and with the lives of people. From a purely literary and intellectual perspective, one could enjoy this creative game, she wrote, if only the frivolity with which things are passed over that deeply affect thousands run counter to those for whom, quote, sentimental reasons of pity, right, so there's also a gendering here, have not yet become obsolete. So Woker here opposed the rationality of science, and also, without saying so, that of law. After all, Zanetti's argument about the humanity of some chemical weapons echoed the legal concept of an optimal and therefore legitimate amount of suffering. To oppose Zanetti's idea was also to oppose law to a certain extent, and yet Woker herself would then turn to law to prohibit chemical weapons in her appeal. And her Woker's argument against poison war is really interesting. On the one hand, she repeats the critique of, in a sense, the perverse application of science and technology to war, and she warns of impending apocalypse of European culture, civilization, and industry. And this was, on the other hand, though, particularly racialized, because what Woker feared in particular was the end of a European race, a fear shared across the Atlantic by someone you might know, William Irwin, a journalist and muckraker, who in 1921, also in the context of warning about chemical warfare, warned of, quote, the destruction of Europe and the, and I'm quoting again, probable extermination of the white race, right? So this is very much embedded in discourses of empire, eugenics, and race. Okay, I know I don't have a lot of time, but I will briefly talk about the 1960s and another moment where I see the emergence of a new central idea that was at the heart of arguments to prohibit some new weapons. And maybe I just highlight this particular source here, which is by Milton Leitenberg, a trained biologist and chemist who specializes in arms control at the University of Maryland. And in this article, Leitenberg worked towards what I would call a prohibition of the known unknown. So you know, or he argued that they did not know how to think about the downstream effects of biological weapons, genetic mutation, and so on. So here's what he wrote. Leitenberg wrote that scientists had not yet, and he implicates himself here, he's a scientist, scientists had not yet learned to control bacteria and viruses. Outside of the laboratory, these agents, he wrote, may propagate, spread, evolve, develop relationships with other living things in ways which cannot be altogether foreseen. He warned of an unknowable chain reaction of alterations in many related life forms following a biological weapons attack. Now, this was similar but not the same argument as the one that chemical weapons or epidemics might uncontrollably spread to affect non-combatants. In that case, the target was difficult to select and control, but the effect was knowable. What Leitenberg warned of here were the unknown and perhaps unknowable downstream effects of a weapon on life on Earth. Okay, so I will conclude and then I look forward to your questions. So what I've tried to tell you here is an intellectual history of weapons prohibitions, right? Weapons prohibitions are very much the domain of diplomacy, of the military, of law. And what I try to do in my work is embed the idea of weapons prohibitions as actually one of the key concerns of a wide range of people who lived in major military states, both during the machine age, so mid-19th century, to the interwar period, and arguably also today. And there are two main animating ideas, I would argue, that lead or at least are called upon to prohibit certain weapons. The first one is about finding, or it's part of a quest of identifying the optimally calibrated weapon, often also called a humane weapon in this discourse. And there, on the one hand, some bullets will be prohibited because they expand or explode and make healing arguably unnecessarily difficult, while others are embraced as causing humane injury. And then the second animating idea has to do with an anxiety about the internal contradiction of industrial and maybe post-industrial society itself as effectively the misuse or use, if you want to put it more neutrally, of science and technology in modern war, and the fact that these applications could, in the end, lead to self-destruction. So I will end here. Thank you so much for your patience and for listening, and I look forward to your questions.
Thanks so much. So I see some new faces in the crowd. So our norm in this seminar is to sort of gather a list of questioners at the beginning. So if you'd like to get on the queue, raise your hand. I'll catch your eye and write you down. And then as we go sort of through, if you want to jump in with a question too, just raise your hand and I'll write you down. So Caitlin, I see you first. Everybody else, please hold your hands. Oh, and also please introduce yourself now to the speaker. So.
Hi, I'm Caitlin. I'm a professor here at SSP. Thanks for your talk. I wanted to ask about kind of how your work does speak to some of the modern arms control or even, treaty on the prohibition of nuclear weapons. I'm just curious from the lens that you've presented, which is, different. It's refreshing from what a lot of us do when we think about these issues. I'm curious how you view debates over those current issues.
Should I answer or are you questioning?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Yes, Caitlin. So nice to meet you. Thank you for this question. Historians are hesitant to pronounce on the present, but I will say something. So one thing that is remarkable to me, and I see this more in the discourses on lethal autonomous weapons, is the persistence of certain discourses from the mid-19th century to the present. And I think that's remarkable because the technological realities of the mid-19th century were so very different than today, right? The discourses were about certain types of bullets, certain types of firearms, as compared to cyber warfare and lethal autonomous weapons. And what has remained is this fact, as I tried to point out in the beginning, of fast technological change and the experience of that. And so these persisting discourses that I mean are basically that there seem to be, so on the one hand, you can discuss weapons in terms of strategy or military effect, but then you also get the emergence of a moral language to make sense of weapons in the mid-19th century. And this moral language positions and tries to make sense of new weapons in terms of their implications for humanity, however defined, right? However restrictively defined. And I argue you have sort of the techno-optimism, right? New weapons are good for humanity because they shorten wars, or they cause, von Bruns's humane bullet wounds that he can fix. You have the techno-utopian idea, which, persists today in certain ways, right? John Yu has argued that actually cyber warfare will help prevent war in certain ways. And then you also have techno-pessimism. And actually, which are the people who argue that some new weapons are bad for humanity, therefore they should be outlawed. We need to turn to international law. And all three of them actually sort of reoccur in the discourse on lethal autonomous weapons, right? You have the people who say, oh, they're more humane than human soldiers because they more accurately follow laws of war, international humanitarian law. You of course have the pessimists, right? And you also have the optimists. So I see that's one way to answer it. I'm happy to talk about it more.
Next, Florian, who I should note is a historian, who's with us. So we do have historians occasionally as part of the program. Florian, with that introduction.
Oh, but that was very interesting. Thank you very much for this very insightful presentation. So my question is, how do you account the cultural impact of weapons as opposed to their actual military effectiveness in shaping the prohibitions? For instance, you have the gas, the flamethrower, which have a huge cultural impact and huge incentive to be forbidden, while have no real effectiveness in the field of battle.
Yes. The example, what comes to mind immediately, listening to your question, are the discourses around prohibiting chemical weapons, and in particular, aerochemical warfare in the 1920s. Because there's a real distinction here, right? So you have these military surgeons in the 19th century, and they measure and they mismeasure, right? They get it wrong so often, but they try to pin down exactly what the effect is of a particular bullet on a body. And then and that arguably drives the prohibition, along with geopolitics and so on. In the 1920s, the specter that in a sense is really central to anyone opposing chemical warfare is the idea that an aircraft, probably a German aircraft, will descend upon London, will descend over New York, will drop 5 drops of some poison, and it will work as a weapon of mass destruction. And that actually never mapped onto the science. So there's a way in which imagination becomes, I can't say if it becomes more and more important over time, but there's a distinct difference here in the importance of imagination in driving weapons prohibitions between the 19th century and the 1920s. And this is now speculation, so I probably shouldn't do it, but there's a way in which it's really hard to find good representations of lethal autonomous weapons, like not just the depiction of, the drone, but typically, you read articles and they resort to the zeros and ones and so on. So I wonder then if that also opens up more space for the role of the imagined in these discourses. Yeah, and that is not just about military effectiveness. Yeah.
Hanoi.
Sure. Ken Oy, Political Science, Data Systems, CIS. First, thank you very much for an historically rich and difficult presentation. So on the one hand, when you were going over varieties of kinetic stuff, exploding bullets, dropped from the air or not, it was a complicated story.
Mm-hmm.
And the rationales for limitation or not were shifting from time to time and place to place. On the other hand, when you were talking biological weapons, it's basically a story of prohibition. Not much use, and the bans, starting with bans on bacteriological weapons, by extension, virology, by extension on to CRISPR-enabled systems now, have been pretty complete and pretty universally accepted. So my question is, why is your story complicated for exploding bullets and other stuff, even shotguns in trench warfare? But the outcome to be explained is simply as new stuff comes along in bio, it gets banned. Why? Is bio different?
There's one way to answer the question. I'm not sure if I'm convinced by it.
Okay.
But that way of answering your question would be to say that there are, one deep, almost anthropological revulsions about biological weapons. So that would be, in a sense, not a historical argument. There would also be the way of saying, look at Vattel, look at other 18th century legal scholars, and already there, you know, in their treatises, they prohibit the use of poison in war. And some scholars, some historians have made the argument that the prohibitions of bacteriological and chemical weapons, and then also the BWC and so on, that they effectively built upon and reused an older taboo on poison, on the use of poison in war. That goes back at least to the 18th century, maybe further. So I think I will say that in response to your question. And I mean, another way of thinking through your question would be to think about military effectiveness, right? So, I mean, I want to sort of insist that there is an intellectual history to tell about weapons prohibitions, right? But of course, there's also the story of geopolitics and military interest that decides which weapons in the end get prohibited. And the story I didn't have time to tell, and also maybe, you know, it isn't central to my question about the Biological Weapons Convention, is that why was there political will to unilaterally end the US biological weapons program in 1969, right? That was the Nixon administration. And then why was there political will in Britain and Russia, in the Soviet Union, sorry, to join? It was because of this conception in the great military powers of the middle of the Cold War that biological weapons were the poor country's nuclear bomb. And so if you have the nuclear bomb, you don't need the biological weapon. So yeah, that's another way to think through your question.
Later.
Later, yeah. I'm curious to hear what you think.
Okay, see you next, Sam.
Hi, thanks for the talk. Sam Leiter, I'm a grad student here at SSP. I was just curious, and this is maybe a stretch considering the sort of physical impacts of weaponry, but was there ever any discussion of the psychological impacts and sort of the long-term implications there, especially after World War I? Or was the focus in the intellectual history entirely on sort of the long-term optimal calculus for physical damage to the human body?
Yeah, great question. At least in my sources, I mean, I know, right, the literature on shell shock, right, and it reverberated widely in you know, culture as well, in European countries after the First World War. Somehow I haven't seen a connection of that yet to the discourses of prohibiting chemical weapons around the League, or, you know, in the writings of pacifists and so on. It is really focused sort of on the threat to the city and to industrial civilization and an empire that would be posed. Like it's a very collectivist discourse in a way, right? It's not about individual psychological harm. Something different is at stake here. So I think I would say tentatively no, and I will return to my sources to check if I'm right. The one thing that comes to mind is, of course, war is also psychological, and actually, I forget who it was, so I don't want to lie, but you know, in my sources on the explosive bullets in the 1860s, it was some Prussian, I think, military general said he thought explosive bullets were humane because of their psychological impact. So you would fire them on a munition wagon, which is what they were first developed for, and then the ruckus, the noise, would spread terror among soldiers, and importantly horses, right? Because horses were a part of warfare in 1860s Europe. And so the horses would gallop off the field, and that would be far more humane than actually engaging in combat. So there's a real appreciation here of the psychological.
From the techno-optimist perspective.
From the very much techno-optimist perspective. Yes, thank you for using that term. Yes, exactly. But you were asking about the techno-pessimist. Yeah. I think cautiously no.
Okay, thank you.
It's like a Big Bang theory of anti-cavalry warfare.
Yes.
Very pleasant.
So when I was listening to your talk, I was trying to draw connections from discussions about weapons oriented, weapons, some arguments about why we should like this thing. And then the principles of the conduct of war become stickier, like proportionality, caution, and distinction. And I'm wondering is there an intellectual history that connects these weapon and technology-oriented discussion to the evolution of sort of codification of the laws of armed conflict? I'm ignorant about it.
Two ways of answering this question. Of course, they're connected, right? And I think about this in two ways. One is something I'm arguing against. And there is some scholarship in legal history, or actually written by international lawyers, who try to trace proportion, distinction, and precaution back from today's IHL into 19th century laws of war, because this is when the codification project started, right, with the Lieber Code as the national codification, and then subsequently the international codifications at Brussels, Oxford, The Hague, and so on. And I think that is a fair project for an international legal scholar, because after all, their project is to legitimize the norms that are foundational to their area of practice. But the sources in the 19th century do not use the term proportionality. They don't use the term distinction, and they certainly don't use the term precaution. And so as a historian, the way I understand my role is to be really precise about the kinds of terms historical actors use, and actually distinction, for example, in its present form is really a product, to my understanding, of the 1977 protocols additional to the Geneva Conventions, right? So that's really the beginning of the present, I think, in terms of IHL. So in that sense, my project stands in some tension with this sort of teleological project of reading present-day legal concepts back into the past. Now, there is a way in which the 19th and 20th century codification projects very much are an important part of the history I'm telling. And that is, how do I say this briefly? Weapons prohibitions do not start as a humanitarian project, right? Like, you can read accounts that will tell you otherwise, but it is really, in my view, a real political tool by Imperial Russia, because they're, having budgetary difficulties, they're behind in the arms race with the other European powers and so on. And so it is a very sort of non-idealistic project in the beginning. And in 1868, modern international law hasn't really been born as a discipline. So it's not their project, right? It's not the project of international lawyers in the beginning. It's military experts, it's diplomats. But after the Institut du Droit International is founded, right, the first big institute that brings together liberal international lawyers in 1873, they have a journal, right? And in that journal, they start claiming or reclaiming this initial prohibition for their purposes, and start interpreting it as something that it was not. And so there's sort of a magical property to law and legal codification that plays out throughout this entire history.
Right. Hi, Bright Smith, also a PhD student. So I'm gonna be a little unfair and ask like a very specific historical question that just may not fall within this research scope. So yeah. If that's the case, I apologize. So I work a lot on World War I, and one of the things that I have come across in my research is the decision that is kind of, it's not a focus of mine, but it's just something I find interesting, is the decision by the German High Command to use the gas shells in the Second Battle of Prague, 1915. And it strikes, one thing that I've never come across clearly is sort of, they basically run across the legal. They're just kind of like, we don't really care. What I've never been sure of is, did they know that it was illegal, or did they argue that it was not illegal when they were kind of making this decision? And then to be connected to this, how does that kind of awareness of the actions, the legality or illegality of actions in the First World War contribute to how things are changed afterwards?
So Isabel Hull is really the person who should be here to answer the question, right? Because she has written, I think, the book in the last, well, now it's 12 years ago, but it feels like yesterday, right? On international law in the First World War, and how the First World War both made and broke, or broke and then made international law and laws of war. And I think what she shows really convincingly is how laws of war constrained the decisions of the German military high command less than the militaries of Britain and France. So I'm convinced by that. And she also shows, and I see this in my sources as well, that this was conscious disregard, right? So of course the German foreign ministry knew about the prohibition of projectiles whose sole purpose it is to disperse gas at the 1899 Hague Peace Conference, and then that was renewed, right, in 1907, I believe. And so it was conscious. And in fact, I mean, the German Foreign Office engaged effectively in a form of lawfare, and they weren't the only ones. The Russians did it too, France did it too, Britain did it too, and so effectively it became this game of mutual accusation and trying to clear your own name, because strangely enough, right, even though we all know that international law is the outcome of negotiation, it takes on this mantle of morality, right? So to follow law is better than to not follow the law, no matter what kind of standard the law codifies. And so anyway, to answer your question directly, like did the German military defend their actions of at the Second Battle of Ypres? Yes, they did, and they did so in legal terms. So it's not a convincing legal argument, but effectively they argued that they had not been the first to use chemical weapons in the First World War because, and this is a real distinction to today's IHL, in the 19th century, a prohibition, for example, on the use of these gas projectiles was only valid as long as you were in a war with other signatory powers and as long as everyone else, I mean, your opponent followed that rule. And so if the French military first violates the prohibition on the use of these gas projectiles, all bets are off. The German military can do whatever they wanted. And it was not a convincing legal argument, but they turned to law to defend their actions, which I think illustrates also something about the importance of codification and how law takes on these magical properties of distinguishing between moral and immoral conduct and weapons use.
Peter? Yes, Peter Purdue, formerly of MIT history, now back in town.
Welcome back.
I work on Chinese history, by the way. If I may say so, it'd be fair to say that the specter of racism haunts this discourse.
Yes.
And it appears at least two ways in your talk. First, in the, say the British use of dum-dum bullets in colonial periods. Colonized people are not really considered to be under this particular type of negotiation. And in the second place, as you said, the impending doom of the white race that seems to be coming due to mutual self-destruction, right? How do they deal with that in this discourse itself? It's one of my questions. It struck me that one of them is to invoke a very abstract universal humanity, which is not specified ethnically or racially at all. And the other is to focus on local technical details, such as, say, the military surgeons working on, so it seems, only European soldiers. There may be others expressions as part of this. I mean, as a China historian, I'm always struck that the year after the 1899 Hague Conference, when 8 Allied armies invaded Beijing and committed mass atrocities, it was very clear that these rules didn't apply to non-European powers, right? So is this just our own post-colonial perspective that we are adding to this, or were there voices at the time, anti-imperial, anti-colonial activists who contributed to this discourse?
Well, I wouldn't call them anti-colonial activists, but Russian delegates at the Hague Peace Conference called out the British delegates for their imperial hierarchy of violence and dignity, really, right? I think that was, yeah, I can just say that this argument was made. I can't comment on how genuine it was. I mean, Russia itself is an imperial power and a colonial power at that time, right? So I think there's a real question of when do the laws of war, which, I mean, as you could tell, I mean, I'm a historian of modern Europe. This is also a Eurocentric project, really. And there's a real question in the literature on the laws of war when something that begins as a product of Europe's empires becomes a global project, right? Like basically what can be rescued from the rubble, right, of racism and imperialism and so on. And you know, there are different perspectives on this in the literature. I mean, one way to answer this question is that there is something that meaningfully changes in IHL in 1977 with the additional protocols, right, when additional protocol 1 and 2 extend some protections of international law, also like not from just state-on-state warfare, which raises the question of what's a state, right? And the state is not part of the empire, to also non-international armed conflict and wars of national liberation. But you know, you can also argue or find arguments that these hierarchies, in a sense, persist. Yeah, I think it's an open question. By the way, this question of whether the laws of war ever applied or weapons prohibitions ever applied beyond wars between two European or European-esque states is actually sort of a matter of discussion between historians now. So Peter Holquist at UPenn is working on the legal codification project in Imperial Russia, because Russia took a leading role, right, in many of these 19th century conferences, if not almost all. And the debate is about whether the non-extension of laws of war was fundamentally because of racism or fundamentally because of concerns about reciprocity.
You said what? Reciprocity?
Yeah, so basically the reciprocity is this idea that, right, if two parties agree to certain rules of war, adherence to these rules is dependent upon the idea that both of these actors adhere to it, right? It doesn't make sense to constrain yourself if the other belligerent does not restrain themselves as well, right? And so anyway, there's a small historiographical debate as to whether the principal driver of the non-extension of certain protections to warfare beyond Europe was because of racism or because of concerns about non-reciprocity. It might be, a difference without a distinction or not, but you know, it's a question.
I had one comment. Just
Sure.
you mentioned lawfare, which is an extent, I mean, the use of invoking legal codes as moral norms, say, to, as it were, weaponize against the enemy. Well, we can also talk about lootfare, I believe, at least in the post-Boxer China, where 8 armies were there. They were all looting Chinese treasures, but each one was claiming that they did have looting or expropriation in a more rational manner than the others. You know, so the British had sort of open markets where you could bid for things, whereas they claimed the Russians just grabbed it. So there was lootfare going on, and I don't know if you can say something about the morality of looting, and if that is part of this legal discourse.
I don't really touch on looting in my work, but I will briefly say, I mean, privateering is in a sense a form of looting on the ocean, on the seas. And oh no, I broke it. No, I didn't. Okay, John Stuart Mill, when he was talking in the House of Commons in 1867, the reason why he's a liberal, he was against the emerging military academic industrial complex, if you will, in Britain at the time. But what he was really arguing for in this speech was against the Treaty of Paris of 1856, which had prohibited privateering, which Mill argued was the natural weapon of the British Empire.
Charlie Glazer.
Hi, thank you for your talk. I'm a senior fellow here at SSP. I was interested, you said you're doing an intellectual history or a history of the ideas, and a few times you sort of bracketed it by saying, yes, I know there's this, yes, I know there's, and I'm just wondering, as it's a it's a kind, I mean, it's very valuable to trace the ideas, but there are also, when a few times, you know, there are also interested what produces an outcome. And that's a few times you said this idea won, which implied the idea won, but it might not have been the idea. It might have been the people or forces behind the idea. So I'm just wondering how comfortable you are, and you know, it's a very different discipline with sort of looking at the ideas, but not so much at looking at the influence necessarily of the people who promoted the ideas or the interest behind the ideas and so forth, and sort of how you make that, you know, keep them separate in your work and when you have to put in qualifications and so forth.
So I already ran over time for this presentation. Power and diplomatic decision-making is part of the book, right? So, and actually I would argue that this, and I will say though, this intellectual history is at the center of the book. And I would actually argue that practices of power and what produces a certain outcome is really closely entangled and constrained by the rise of these moral languages to make sense of new weapons. So to give you the example of the St. Petersburg Declaration, for example, and I'm not going to tell you the whole story because we'll run out of time, but the way it happens is that Alexander Gorchakov, the Russian foreign minister, sends out a circular to the European courts in St. Petersburg and decries the unnecessary suffering, the inhumanity of these new small caliber bullets that detonate upon impact with soft tissue. And none of the, or, you know, for example, the Prussians receive this invitation and they're not fans of this at all, right? I mean, they're preparing to unify Germany under its leadership and so on, but they respond in the same key, in the same sort of language of humanity and say, well, Mr. Gorchakov, this is, or His Excellency, this is a great idea, and we propose to extend your principle of humanity even farther, and we propose to outlaw all new weapons of war, right? And so, and then, you know, it's all also very constrained by diplomatic politesse and so on, and I have records of people at the Russian court who say, well, we welcome this Prussian proposal, it only completes the Russian idea, but of course it doesn't, right? It's an act of subterfuge. And so this is just one example of how appeal to moral principle, on the one hand, can help push through real political interest, right? Like constraining an arms race and so on, but it can come back to haunt the person who first begins arguing on moral grounds and then also constrain them. Yeah, I will end here because I think there are more questions, but I'm happy to talk about this more. I think my point is sort of one about moral politics, right? And the ways in which the concepts, the conceptual environments within which diplomatic decision-making happens do something to that decision-making process. Now, does just power or this idea that biological weapons are the poor country's nuclear weapon matter? Absolutely, of course. The naval arms race between Germany, Imperial Germany and Britain also absolutely matters, right? Real power matters, but I also argue that ideas matter as well.
Great. Ron.
Thank you. I'm Ron Siegel, an alumnus of the program. And I'm wondering how the neutron bomb fits into your schema.
Say more.
40 years ago, it was a source of great concern, particularly in Europe. And it basically is a weapon that would kill all the people within a couple of kilometers and leave the physical infrastructure alone. But on the other hand, the technology behind it was a big step toward cleaner nuclear weapons, that is, with much less radioactive fallout. So what do you think?
How does this fit into the story? You know, I don't know enough about the history of this weapon to really say much. I mean, it seems to be, and I'm speculating here, you know, historians don't like doing this, but it seems to be almost this attempt at a, I mean, it's a certain form of sort of technical optimism that is sort of attached to this weapon, that you can use a nuclear weapon and also have the effect be very precise, right? It's sort of an attempt to act against the sprawling, terrible impact on, like, in terms of radiation, on infrastructure and so on. Of course, you can immediately see how that would serve the goals of any person seeking to, or any entity seeking to control the place after the attack, right? Because the infrastructure is intact and so on. Yeah, I don't have a great answer to the question. I will just say that what strikes me is that, of course, I mean, I talk about sort of the techno-utopian idea that a transgressively destructive weapon will bring peace. Of course, I mean, nuclear deterrence theory, and I'm grateful you're not grilling me on it, but that's sort of what's on everyone's mind, right? And I think it's sort of remarkable that this is sort of an example for, yeah, an attempt to sort of attenuate, but also in a sense, heighten even more so the effects of nuclear weapons. To be continued.
To be continued,
Yeah.
for sure.
Yeah.
I feel like there was a hand in the
Yes.
back that I missed. So Jim, I'm really sorry, but I think you lowered it before I had
Sorry.
put a face to a hand. So Jim, over to you.
Well, Jim Walsh, SSP. I very much enjoyed your talk. And I want to ask about what I think is your second phase as the conversation moves from talks about individual effects on soldiers to apocalyptic visions of society. I do want to say in passing, though, even though Milton Lightenberg was a lion of a guy, every MIT talk that talks about the BWC should mention Matt Messels.
Yes, I know. I know.
So,
Guilty.
to my question.
Guilty. Yes. It was actually in my notes and I ran out of
Yes,
time.
well, home team and all that. In any case, so there's this argument that begins to get being made in the second phase about the dangers to civilization, visions of the apocalypse. Insofar as the pro-ban intellectuals who are articulating reasons for ban are in some dialogue with those who oppose those ideas. Like a lot of times people are just talking past each other, right? I see a lot of that today. But insofar as in the past there was a dialectic of argument, then what was the pro-ban's toughest argument to deal with from the other side, from the anti-ban side? When they said this is a risk to civilization, probably seemed pretty reasonable, then or whatever. Then the other side made an argument that then the pro-ban side had difficulty with. So what argument is that they had difficulty with that was strong for their opponents in this intellectual back and forth?
Yeah, so in the 1920s, right, I briefly mentioned the disenchantment with international law after the First World War, the making and breaking of law, and it was enforcement is what I most see. So
the argument might have been, this is all great, but it's not practical.
It's not practical, and then what good is it to solidify this moral boundary if we know that the industrial states will continue to maintain their readiness for chemical warfare?
Without taking on the actual argument about threat to civilization, right? It shifts. That's an argument that shifts.
Typically,
true, but there's nothing we can do.
From what I've seen,
yeah. Okay,
yeah.
Thank you.
I will also just very briefly say that there was, I mean, obviously opposition from certain branches of the military, right, like the CWS and so on, to the Geneva Gas Protocol. At the same time, it was actually not as central to what the League of Nations and the Temporary Mixed Commission was really after. What they wanted, and this, what was actually control of the international trade in munitions. The conference that the Geneva Gas Protocol comes out of is the conference on the supervision of the international trade in arms and ammunition and implements of war. So to prohibit chemical weapons was in a sense a consolation prize at that particular moment, which is a theme that repeats also from the 1899 Hague Peace Conference, right? It was far more ambitious in the beginning, wanting to outlaw far more weapons, but also like greater arbitration and so on. And so really the history of weapons prohibitions is the history of disappointments, both on its own terms and on the terms of others who look at that history, I would say. So sometimes the opponents didn't have that much work to do.
Well, thank you, Elena, for absolutely terrific talk. I want to flag before we collectively thank her, her next book project on the history of arms exports from the three post-war Germanys, East, West, and Unified. So I very much hope you'll come back and share with us that work as well. So please join me in thanking.